In 1622, a royal delegation arrived in the Portuguese stronghold of Luanda. Nzinga, sister to the king of Ndongo, had come to negotiate peace with Governor Correia de Sousa. The governor, intending to assert dominance, provided no chair, forcing her to stand while he sat. In a moment echoing through history, Nzinga signaled a servant to drop to hands and knees, creating a living throne. She sat, meeting the governor's gaze at eye level. This anecdote is often retold as a triumph of pride, but that interpretation misses the point. Nzinga was not merely performing theater, she was demonstrating leverage. The Portuguese believed they were facing a desperate tribal envoy. In reality, they were facing a geopolitical mastermind who understood their colony was bankrupt without her cooperation. Nzinga would not just outfight the Portuguese Empire, she would systematically outspend, starve, and eventually buy them out of existence. To understand Nzinga's strategy, we must first dismantle the Portuguese motivation. The crown held Angola not for land, but as an industrial extraction point designed for one purpose: supplying human labor to the sugar plantations of Brazil. Without a constant stream of captives flowing from the interior, the colony was a financial disaster. This economic reality defined the battlefield. Every musket ball fired and every mercenary hired required payment, and in 17th century Angola, the only reliable currency was human life. The Portuguese administration was perilously dependent on local puppet rulers, known as sobas, to feed this supply chain. They needed a high volume of traffic to remain solvent. This created a paradoxical vulnerability at the heart of their power. The Portuguese military machine was terrifying, but it ran on a very specific fuel: slaves. And that fuel had to pass through narrow geographic corridors. Nzinga realized that if she could control the flow of this black gold, the Portuguese guns would eventually fall silent from a lack of necessary operational funds. It was pure math. By the late 1620s, Nzinga faced total annihilation. The Portuguese had installed a puppet king in Ndongo, driving her into the bush. Most leaders would have fought a desperate, romantic, and ultimately futile guerrilla war until they were captured. Nzinga did not. She recognized that fighting the Portuguese on their terms was suicide, so she changed the battlefield entirely. She led her forces east and violently conquered the kingdom of Matamba. This was not a retreat, it was a hostile corporate takeover. Matamba was strategically positioned as the gateway to the deep interior, controlling the primary arteries of the slave trade. By seizing this economic high ground, Nzinga placed a stranglehold on the Portuguese economy. She effectively installed a toll booth on the entire colony's supply line. If the Portuguese wanted captives to sell, they now had to go through her or face a completely dry market. This seizure of Matamba transformed her from a rebel into a rival economic power. She began diverting the flow of human traffic to her own markets, selling captives to Dutch merchants, who offered better rates than the Portuguese. The profits were immediate and immense. She used this wealth to purchase European muskets by the thousands, building a professionalized, modernized standing army. Nzinga had stopped fighting for survival and started fighting for market dominance, using the enemy's own economic hunger to bankroll her new war machine. We must confront a difficult historical reality. Nzinga is often romanticized as a liberator, but her resistance required a grim moral compromise. She was not an abolitionist, she was a survivalist. To protect her state from being devoured by the Portuguese slave machine, she determined that she must become the machine's operator. She allied with the Imbangala, a ruthless mercenary cult, utilizing their brutal tactics to consolidate her authority. Furthermore, she executed a brilliant but cynical diplomatic maneuver by inviting the Dutch, Portugal's fierce global rivals, to the Angolan coast. Nzinga realized she could sell captives to the Dutch in exchange for high-quality weaponry that the Portuguese refused to sell her. This created a devastating feedback loop for Luanda. Nzinga would capture prisoners during border conflicts, sell them to the Dutch fleet, and use the proceeds to purchase gunpowder and muskets. These weapons were then turned against the Portuguese soldiers sent to capture those very slaves. She effectively monetized the war, trading specific lives to purchase the general liberty of her entire kingdom. It is a dark paradox. Nzinga defeated the European slave trade by mastering it, proving that in this era, moral purity was a luxury. But gunpowder was a necessity. From the 1630s through the 1650s, the conflict settled into a grinding war of attrition that the Portuguese ultimately could not afford. The colonial governors sent wave after wave of military expeditions to crush the Queen of Matamba. But Nzinga had perfected the art of the fighting retreat. Worse, she weaponized sanctuary. She broadcast a standing offer of freedom to any slave who escaped Portuguese territory and reached her lines. This induced a mass exodus of the very labor force Luanda relied upon. Thousands fled the plantations to join Nzinga's army, simultaneously swelling her ranks while bleeding the Portuguese economy dry. This was the strategic turning point. Every military campaign requires upfront capital, and the governor of Luanda was spending a fortune on soldiers, supplies, and logistics to chase a phantom enemy, with absolutely zero return on investment. There was no plunder to be had, only empty villages and ambushes. Nzinga had successfully turned the colony of Angola into a massive financial liability for the Portuguese crown. She simply made the war too expensive to win. By the mid-1650s, the accountants in Lisbon reached the same conclusion as the generals in Luanda. Continued war with Nzinga was bankruptcy, and peace was the only affordable option left. In 1656, after decades of bloodshed, the unthinkable happened. Nzinga, now in her 70s, watched as the Portuguese Empire officially blinked. They signed a treaty that did not just offer a ceasefire, but total capitulation to her demands. The Portuguese recognized her absolute sovereignty over Matamba, formally renounced claims to her territory, and finally returned her sister, held hostage for years. This was not a diplomatic gift from a benevolent European power. It was a resignation letter. Nzinga had successfully held the interior's wealth hostage long enough to force a peer-to-peer relationship with a global superpower. She lived the rest of her days as a free monarch, her kingdom intact, having outlasted 10 different Portuguese governors and 2 kings of Spain and Portugal. She won. History remembers Queen Nzinga as a warrior, the woman who sat on a servant's back. But this reductionist view obscures her true genius. She was not just a fighter, she was an institution builder and a master of high-stakes geopolitics. Nzinga's life offers a potent counter-narrative to colonial history. Indigenous resistance was not doomed by a lack of technology, but often failed due to a lack of economic leverage. Nzinga succeeded because she understood that logistics win wars. She bankrolled her own freedom by mastering the very dark economic systems the Europeans brought to her shores, turning the slave trade into a weapon of independence. Today, her statue stands in Luanda, shadowing the city she once threatened to bankrupt. A reminder that power is not just about who holds the gun, but who pays for the powder.